You inherit power, believing history is behind you, unaware its patterns are already pacing quietly at your back, patient and familiar. At first, control feels solid like stone beneath your feet, even as unseen hands begin measuring its weight limits. You accept early compromises as wisdom because resistance seems childish when stability is framed as adulthood. Debt enters politely, never forcing doors, sitting down as if it belongs heavy enough to rearrange the room. You expand outward through promises and projects, mistaking motion for strength. While foundations quietly thin, advisors speak in calm tones, teaching you to smile while pressure increases in increments too small to protest. Markets move invisibly, like tides felt only by those already standing in the water. You trade future flexibility for present calm, convincing yourself tomorrow will adapt as easily as today. Each rescue feels like relief, though the rope tightens a fraction more every time it is thrown. Borders remain drawn on maps, yet control shifts elsewhere, and flags become decorative habits. Laws bend gently, never snapping shape to relieve strain without restoring balance. Public services fade unevenly, and you rename the loss efficiency to avoid naming what is missing. Currency survives on confidence alone, a shared agreement repeated daily to keep doubt contained. Dependency dresses itself as cooperation, smiling while limiting how far you can step away. Streets stay calm, and calm becomes evidence even when it is manufactured carefully. Pressure grows harder to describe because language thins where discomfort becomes constant. You are told this phase is temporary, and you believe it because permanence would demand action. History feels distant, yet its rhythm aligns perfectly with your present choices. Decisions arrive pre-shaped now, asking only for signatures rather than debate. This is how the pattern begins, not through force, but through reasonable steps taken too often. You begin to sense repetition, where progress was promised, days looping smoothly enough that standing still feels like forward motion. Public confidence is rehearsed, daily smiles practiced, until sincerity becomes indistinguishable from fatigue. Procedures multiply gently, like vines covering walls, without ever cracking them. You wait for clarity, but clarity is delayed politely, always scheduled just beyond the next meeting. Access replaces authority, and doors decide outcomes before voices ever rise. You learn which questions slow the room and which silences keep it moving. Markets announce reassurance in steady tones, calming nerves while tightening margins unseen. Promises are renewed with updated language, old meanings softened, until they pass unnoticed. Infrastructure grows impressive at the edges, while choices narrow at the center. You plan within limits you did not set, calling it realism to preserve dignity. Protests shrink into symbols safely framed so they cannot spill. Numbers speak louder than faces, and you stop arguing with arithmetic you cannot see. Wealth rises vertically, lifting skylines while streets below dim quietly. History is summarized into slogans, complex causes, folded into manageable phrases. Education rewards adjustment, teaching balance instead of resistance. Repairs arrive faster than reflection, keeping surfaces intact. You feel pressure without direction, a steady push with no visible source. Dependency is described as mutual, though exits remain one-sided. Choice survives only as navigation, never as destination. The pattern deepens here, where endurance replaces outrage. As civic virtue, time starts behaving strangely, stretching in public and compressing in private until urgency feels like a personal flaw. Schedules slide subtly, not to stop movement, but to ensure no one arrives together. Transportation slows without halting distance, growing heavier while routes remain officially open. Goods still circulate, but only where obedience has already settled into routine. Insurance replaces certainty. Selling reassurance back to you after risk is carefully introduced. Crisis drills repeat so often that real danger would feel familiar, almost welcomed. Aid arrives, pre-approved decisions, made before suffering is allowed to speak. Borders remain symbolic, while movement funnels through memory-keeping gates. Observation becomes courteous, wrapped in convenience and polite automation. You exchange privacy for access, mistaking doors for freedom. Infrastructure hums constantly, warning that stopping would be irresponsible. Energy sites glow like modern altars, demanding uninterrupted faith. Darkness is applied selectively, not as failure, but as instruction. You learn which neighborhoods dim first and which never do. Temporary rules linger quietly, renewed long after emergencies fade. Authority spreads outward into systems, leaving no single figure to confront. You feel monitored by processes, rather than people tireless and impartial. The city keeps working, and that becomes proof everything is justified. Collapse advances, disguised as maintenance, one reasonable adjustment at a time. Direction replaces choice so completely that stopping feels unnatural. Choice survives only as presentation offered like a menu, where every dish uses the same hidden ingredients. You are surrounded by options, yet each requires identical permissions, making freedom feel abundant but unreachable. Language grows smoother, sanding sharp truths into phrases safe enough to repeat without consequence. Movement is encouraged only along approved currents, where drifting feels voluntary and resistance feels awkward. Those who move against flow are not punished, merely delayed, until fatigue teaches alignment. Access becomes reputation. Invisible scores opening doors before words are spoken. Inequality stops looking cruel and starts looking optimized, clean, and strangely efficient. Data speaks first, now deciding outcomes before faces ever enter the room. Appeals exist in theory, looping endlessly through corridors that return you to the beginning. Patience is praised as virtue, while urgency is treated as instability. Surveillance announces itself, proudly framed as protection rather than intrusion. Cameras face outward, teaching you the danger is always somewhere else. The city grows quieter, not from peace, but from synchronization. Public emotion smooths into neutrality, extremes filtered out for efficiency. History flattens its peaks, shaved down until nothing rises high enough to challenge. Even outrage becomes scheduled, appearing briefly before dissolving on cue. Participation replaces dissent because involvement feels like influence. Gratitude is requested, constantly turning thanks into a binding contract. Belief finishes the work enforcement no longer needs to do. Collapse deepens here, disguised as harmony maintained too carefully. Comfort is distributed carefully, now released in measured doses, so dissatisfaction never gathers enough weight to fall. Public celebrations return brighter, timed precisely to overwrite memories that were becoming inconvenient. Relief follows obedience so consistently that cause and effect feel natural rather than taught. Scarcity appears selectively, never enough to provoke anger, only enough to train anticipation. You begin planning around absence, treating missing pieces as normal features rather than warnings. Emergency language softens into routine phrasing, urgency diluted without ever being withdrawn. You adapt faster than before, predicting adjustments early to spare yourself surprise. Systems reward foresight only when it aligns with pre-approved outcomes. Hope is permitted, but only in small, controlled directions. You thank the structure for sparing you worse scenarios you never actually see. Comparison becomes control, showing distant collapses to justify quiet endurance here. The outside world is framed as reckless, unstable, and undeserving of imitation. Closed borders begin to feel comforting, even when nothing waits beyond them. You internalize limits until they travel with you, light but constant. Freedom shifts from practice into memory, discussed rather than exercised. Renewal replaces decision, extending yesterday forward without reconsideration. You sense resistance would now require dismantling habits you rely on. Collapse no longer approaches. It is embedded in procedure. Nothing dramatic happens, and the absence of drama is taken as proof. History later wonders why this moment felt so reasonable while it happened. Crisis management becomes permanent, staffed, and funded like a seasonless theater that never closes its doors. Headlines shrink into updates. Urgency replaced by continuity promised in smaller, quieter words. Life is measured by extensions now, calendars filled with renewals instead of beginnings. Leaders rotate ceremonially while policies remain seated, unmoved by applause or outrage. Responsibility thins across committees, spread wide enough to evaporate. Apologies arrive early, cushioning failures before they can bruise trust. Risk slides downward gently, while reassurance floats upward like steam. Systems correct people rather than errors, adjusting behavior to fit decisions already made. Care language expands, even as refusal space contracts. Silence is logged as consent, absence recorded as approval. Public debate becomes ritual outcomes known before microphones warm. Opposition survives as exhibit protected safely behind rails. You are invited to participate endlessly, never to decide. Feedback loops close tightly, accepting input only if it confirms direction. You edit your thoughts early, saving energy by removing doubt. Self-censorship begins feeling efficient, even responsible. Anger is scheduled briefly, then escorted back to normal. Normal expands to absorb everything, leaving no outside reference. Collapse no longer needs momentum. Habit carries it forward. Stopping now would require imagination stronger than routine. Fear cools into fatigue, a heavy, quiet settling, where urgency once burned bright enough to gather people together. Alerts continue arriving, but they sink into routine like rain absorbed by streets already darkened. You still comply, not from belief, but because habit moves faster than thought. Tiredness becomes functional, slowing reaction just enough to prevent shared momentum. Care messages soften further their kindness, designed to lower resistance rather than heal. The system relies on exhaustion, knowing rest seeks comfort, not change. Days blur into a continuous present, edges removed, so nothing feels like a beginning or an end. You stop marking time because nothing resolves long enough to deserve memory. Small failures occur constantly reframed as adjustments before they can register as loss. Repairs replace prevention, and patches are praised as progress. Recovery is spoken everywhere, yet no one agrees on what it would restore. Hope is rationed carefully, released in portions too small to inspire risk. Collective memory thins history, compressed into phrases easy to carry and easier to drop. Forgetting becomes maintenance quietly enforced to keep surfaces smooth. The future is shortened into manageable horizons, never far enough to threaten design. Long vision is labeled impractical, a luxury incompatible with efficiency. You plan only for continuity, mistaking survival for success. Collapse settles into the background, a condition rather than an event. Endings disappear because endings invite reflection. The pattern holds strongest when people can no longer imagine what comes after. Fear no longer spikes. It is rationed, delivered in careful doses that keep nerves alert without ever allowing release. Warnings rotate subjects methodically, ensuring anxiety stays warm while never igniting into action. Threats become abstract shapes, distant enough to justify measures, yet vague enough to avoid resistance. You learn to fear patterns instead of events preparing endlessly for something undefined. Preparedness replaces courage, and readiness stands in for decision. Public drills soften into ritual seriousness, diluted into habit. The language of danger expands, while the meaning of safety contracts. Alerts become background weather shaping behavior, without demanding attention. Each new precaution narrows life slightly framed always as care. You stop asking when safety ends, because the question itself feels irresponsible. Risk is described as external, always happening somewhere else. Images of collapse circulate constantly, exhausting the ability to imagine alternatives. Futures are shown only as warnings, never as invitations. Governance shifts into rehearsal, practicing fear until response becomes automatic. Calm begins to feel suspicious, a gap where danger might be hiding. You welcome alerts now, grateful for structure they impose on unease. Silence feels threatening, a void without guidance. Collapse advances through anticipation rather than shock. You remain alert without purpose, awake without direction. This is how fear hardens into infrastructure. Exhaustion replaces fear entirely, settling into muscles and thought like a permanent climate rather than a passing storm. Alerts still arrive, but they dissolve into background noise, absorbed without reaction or memory. You follow instructions automatically, not because you agree, but because questioning now costs too much energy. Fatigue becomes strategic slowing response, just enough to prevent collective movement. Care messages arrive warmer, their softness engineered to pacify rather than restore. The system depends on tired bodies, knowing rest seeks comfort, not disruption. Days blur together until continuity replaces sequence, and nothing feels like a moment worth naming. You stop tracking progress, because nothing ever resolves, only extends. Minor breakdowns occur, constantly reframed as adjustments before they can register as loss. Repair replaces prevention, and patches are celebrated as innovation. Recovery is promised everywhere, yet no one remembers what recovery would return. Hope is delivered in installments small enough to avoid risk. Collective memory thins history, compressed into slogans light enough to discard. Forgetting becomes infrastructure maintained quietly, like roads or lights. The future is shortened, deliberately kept within safe, non-threatening distances. Long vision is discouraged as unrealistic, almost impolite. You plan only for continuity, mistaking endurance for achievement. Collapse feels static now, a background condition, rather than an approaching event. Endings vanish because endings invite responsibility. The pattern reaches maturity when imagining after becomes impossible. You stop expecting collapse because expectation implies an event, and events have been replaced by conditions that quietly persist. What once felt temporary settles into permanence without ceremony, accepted through repetition rather than declaration. Language avoids endings, now preferring maintenance, sustainability, continuation, words that never require closure. Repair feels disruptive compared to smooth continuation, as if fixing too much might expose intention. Nothing was designed to fail loudly because noise would invite questions. The pattern favored erosion, slow enough to feel natural, precise enough to feel inevitable. Stability was never the goal. Predictability was. Predictable people are easier to guide than frightened ones. By removing shock, urgency disappeared. By removing urgency, resistance dissolved. Outcomes are described as unfortunate, yet unavoidable, as if choice never entered the room. Responsibility disperses into committees, reports, and timelines, written in passive voice. You search backward for the moment change was possible, but every step felt reasonable at the time. That is the elegance of the pattern collapse. Never announces itself while happening. When the structure finally names itself, it chooses the word normal. Normal becomes the final shield, protecting the design from scrutiny. The tragedy is not loss, but how gently it was taken. Nothing was seized in panic. Everything was surrendered calmly. History will argue causes later, but it will never feel the pressure you lived inside. This is the financial history pattern no government escapes, because it never looks like collapse until it is complete.